Let's now shift from looking and focusing on income and income sources to the question of income inequality. Now, what I want to do is start at the New Zealand level first of all, just so that you've got the kind of New Zealand context within which these subcatchments are actually positioned. So this is Stats New Zealand data for the years 2004 through to 2010, and this graph is kind of like a pie graph, if you can think of it that way, that represents the proportional breakdown of total net wealth for the entire population of New Zealand. Now, the interesting thing that you see in these graphs is that this portion here of net wealth has been co-opted by the top 1% of the population. This portion here has been co-opted by the next 4% of the population, this portion here by the next 5% of the population, this large portion here by 40% of the population, and this amount of wealth here has been co-opted by the bottom 50% of the population. And as you notice, when you go from with these 2-year intervals, that allocation of wealth across the population basically hasn't changed. You can also see this visually in this graph here. So what we've got here is a graph which shows the bottom 10% of income earners here, or those who have captured net wealth, the bottom, and that hardly registers on the scale. And then the top 10% here, and the scale here, it begins at $250 billion and goes all the way up to $450 billion. This is the top 10%. So obviously, in terms of income inequality or wealth inequality, there is a huge, huge gap here between the bottom 10% and the top 10% across New Zealand as a whole. You can also see this in terms of salary distributions for the country. So this is the distribution curve for salaries. Out here in the middle is the $50,000 per year salary marker. The median salary is sitting at the moment around $36,000 per year. But what you'll notice is that there's a large portion of the population that's actually sitting back here below $50,000. Now, what I want to do now is then look at the issue of income inequality within the subcatchments of the tank catchment, using a Gini coefficient. And I created this graph here just to try and illustrate what a Gini coefficient is about, because I'm aware that probably not all of you are familiar with what this is. On this axis here, you have cumulative income percentage. On this one down here, you have cumulative population percentage. So you've got cumulative population against income. And this dotted straight line up here in the middle between these two axes represents a Gini coefficient of 1, or what you could describe as income equality. In other words, that's the theoretical ideal, that all of the members of the population get a proportionally equal share of the total income that's available for the population for a year. Of course, we know that's not the case. Some get more income and some get less in a capitalist society, and we can measure that difference in income distribution by plotting actual incomes on this graph. And typically what that produces is a graph that looks something like this. You can see that sloping curve down there, which is moving away from equal income distribution towards unequal income distribution. Now, what the Gini coefficient does is, you can see a little double arrowed line here between the line of equality and this dipping line here. The Gini coefficient measures the distance between these two lines to give us some sense of just how far that particular population and its income distribution is moving away from equality. Now, this is for the Ahuriri catchment, this graph, and you'll notice that the Ahuriri catchment has a Gini coefficient of 0.851 for the year 2013. Now I'm going to explain to you the significance of those numbers. This is the Gini, a plot of the Gini coefficient for New Zealand as a whole. We start down here in 1935. We go right through until 2013. Once again, sorry, it's a bit dim on this projector. But basically what it shows you is that the Gini coefficient for New Zealand hovers around between 0.4 and 0.5 over most of this history. Now, if you have a look on the OECD website, then you'll notice that the Ministry of Social Development actually reports a Gini coefficient for New Zealand that is actually down here around 0.3. So I just wanted to explain the difference between these two Gini coefficients. This one comes from the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. The Ministry of Social Development, when they calculate their Gini coefficient, they take the cost of rental and housing repayments out of the Gini coefficient calculation. What they're trying to run their calculation is on household disposable income. And that explains the difference here between these two coefficients. But let's just assume that the Gini coefficient for New Zealand sits somewhere between 0.3 to 0.5. Now let's have a look at the Gini coefficient for the sub-catchment populations within the tank. So we have here the Ahuriri, the Ngaruroro, the Karamu and the Tutaikuri over the years 2001, 2006 and 2013. Here's the Gini coefficient on this axis here. Now what you can see, the basic overall trend is we've gone from a Gini coefficient down here, 0.4, and these ones here are around 0.6, 0.7 in 2001, to a Gini coefficient now that is actually pushing up around 0.8. In other words, what this tells us is that for these sub-catchment populations, we have growing income inequality. And the Gini coefficient that is depicted here in these graphs is well above the national average. This means, and actually the national average itself is already a concern in terms of our position internationally. And just to give you a sense of that, I've produced this graph here, once again based on OECD data. So this is a distribution of Gini coefficients for all of the different OECD countries. Up here you've got a very high Gini coefficient, which means you've got a large income inequality. Down here you've got a very low Gini coefficient, which means less income inequality. You can't see the names on this axis, I'm sorry, so what I've done is I've enlarged them out here just to give you the kind of key markers. So one of the countries in the world that has one of the largest income inequalities is the United States of America, believe it or not, the home of capitalism, pipped only by Mexico and Chile. But New Zealand sits here. So we're in the upper part of this income inequality distribution. The Netherlands down here, and then at the bottom here we've got the Scandinavian countries, Norway, etc., etc. Okay, so then when you go into the tank catchments, we're now pushing well above that national average within the tank catchments. Now, income inequality is not bad per se. I mean, there's a sense in which you always need some income inequality because it provides conditions for innovation, for creativity, and for the emergence of human excellence. It gives us a reason to strive and to be better than what we are. However, income inequality becomes a problem when the income that is being generated by this smaller top percentage of income earners is not effectively trickling down to this group here, and you end up with a very large base who are struggling. Income inequality also becomes a problem when the generation of wealth up here in this top 1 to 10% is being created as a result of environmental harm. And lastly, income inequality is also a problem when it leads to unchecked cultural well-being decline and extinction. Now, I find it very interesting that you don't have to look far on social media to see caricatures or cartoons of this reality. And especially, I don't know if you've ever had a look, but the whole idea of trickle-down economics, go and dial that up with cartoons on social media and see what pops up. I mean, everyone is poking the stick at the idea of trickle-down economics, and yet that's the very model that we are basing our economic well-being on. This one here, I like this one in particular. How about the compromise? We keep the land, the mineral rights, the natural resources, fishing and timber, and we'll acknowledge you as the traditional owners of it. Now, in that last slide, I drew your attention to this issue here, cultural extinction. That's a pretty serious kind of thing to say, so I wanted to actually qualify that, just so that you can see there's some basis to that statement. Now, internationally, there are a documented 6,900 languages in the world today. And that's research that's been done by the Rosetta Foundation. And that implies that there are at least 6,900 distinct cultural entities that exist on planet Earth today. Now that's the good news. The bad news is this, that the rate of language and cultural extinction at the moment, on average, is 1 every 3 months. Which means that within the next 100 years, we are currently projected to lose somewhere between 50 to 90% of the world's linguistic and cultural diversity. And actually, when you run the figures on this and compare it against our ecological species extinction rates, this human cultural extinction problem is actually worse than our ecological species extinction rates in raw percentage terms, and those are already nothing to brag about. Now, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the figures, but what's quoted in the international literature ecological species extinction on average per year sits at somewhere between 5 to 50,000 species per year. Now, why is this happening? To answer this question, you really need to understand how a culture actually survives. A culture survives by having the freedom to give expression to its language, its values, its behaviours, and its institutions on a daily basis. And, for Māori, the institution that is key and crucial to their cultural survival is whānau Māori, that family entity that I was referring to before. That is the basis of the Māori economy. In order to survive, a culture must also adapt to change with creativity and innovation and respond to disturbance events in a way that reclaims, reframes and reinstates its essential identity. So let's now gather up the thoughts from this section on income inequality. What we've seen is that we've got an ageing mobile population. We've seen the loss of whānau kahanunu to other regions and also going overseas. We've got 30 to 40% of population earning less than $50,000 a year. 40% of the population has multiple income sources. 40% of the population is welfare dependent. There's increasing income inequality that is above the national average. And whānau Māori well-being is currently at threshold levels and in some cases actually near the point of extinction. So that's the kind of context that we're talking about when we start to think about the TAP plan.